Hello everyone, this is the Catholic Thinker, and today I am going to do a commentary slash reaction to a video that I saw recently that was recommended by iFunny user SmackJaw5. It was a debate with Christopher Hitchens and a Christian. I'm not sure exactly who the Christian was, as the video snippet that I saw was only of Christopher Hitchens' position. And the title of the video is Christopher Hitchens Destroys Christianity. And I wanted to address a lot of his topics or his points that he made. The first, and this isn't really a point, it's more of a clarification on a position that he holds, or a correction on the position that he holds. First, he does acknowledge and accept that it is possible to be a deist, or to accept that there is a God, somewhat similar to the argument that I presented either on my Why I'm Catholic video or on the Argument for the Existence of God essay. Now first, he does think it is impossible to move from, or to prove, that the deistic God is the Christian God. And if you've read the argument that I posted next about the argument for the existence of the Christian God, you'll see that I disagree with it. But in a nutshell, I will say this, because he does mention that Aquinas couldn't do it. And now I'm not saying I was able to do something that Aquinas couldn't, but there's different levels of argument when, or knowledge when Aquinas was writing and held to. The first is what was called demonstrative knowledge, which was basically a geometrical proof or a math type knowledge, something that had to be this way and could not be any other way. If you notice in the first essay, I argued that it is necessary that there is a God. Now, people disagreed with me, and as in my clarification, their disagreements fell from the premises, and there isn't really much that one can do as far as a premise is concerned. You either accept it or you don't. Now, so the position or the argument that I made, if you accepted those premises, you have to accept that there is a divine being. Now, in my second argument, it was a lot of extremely likely or extremely possible scenarios. So it seems extremely likely that it is this way. Now, from my understanding of scientific theories, my second argument would be similar to a scientific theory, and the first argument would be similar to a scientific law. So a scientific theory, if my understanding of it is correct, and I'm sure I'll be corrected on it if I'm wrong, it is accepted as true, or it is accepted as this way due to the evidence that we currently have. Until evidence to the contrary is presented, and it seems unlikely that evidence to the contrary or evidence that denies the position is presented, it will be accepted as true and fact. So while I do admit that the argument for the existence of the Christian God is not at the same level as the scientific theory, it's similar in structure. I was just trying to state that even science has those different levels. And then finally you have what's called fittingness, and I'll get to that at the end of this talk, as Christopher Hitchens makes an argument that it just doesn't make sense that God would do something in this way, and I'll argue that it does, and that's what fittingness is. God could have done it any other way. We can't show possibility, or we can't show high likelihood, but if it did happen this way, it seems to make sense that it happened this way because of these reasons. An example that Aquinas uses as far as like a fittingness argument is the crucifixion. God didn't have to have Jesus die on the cross. He could have just said, all right, Adam and Eve, you messed up. I forgive you. Let's just start over. We'll forget this ever happened. Or he could have just left us to our own devices and not care what we did. But Aquinas argues, because of the divine plan, it seems fitting to have Jesus die on the cross for these reasons. And I'm not going to get into what those reasons are. That's for another video. Now, the first point that Christopher Hitchens makes that I want to get into is the totalitarian of the afterlife. That there's a God who is in complete control and in complete authority of not only our waking and sleeping hours, but even after we die. There's a couple of books that I would actually recommend for those who have a similar position. Dante's Inferno and The Great Divorce, and you really need to kind of read those two together in order to get an idea of the position that Christianity teaches. The Great Divorce shows how it is possible and likely that one, when coming face to face with God, denies a relationship with God, even though they are being told over and over and over again that heaven is where you want to be, heaven is happy, and some of them know that what they're standing in is the entrance to heaven, and that it's better than hell, but they'd much rather be in hell than acknowledge that they were mistaken, that they were wrong. A couple of examples from The Great Divorce, just to kind of illustrate this point. You have a Christian philosopher, theologian, who has fallen so much in love with the journey to knowledge that he no longer cares about the end of knowledge. And so he'd much rather stay in hell, where he can deceive himself at he's still on that quest for knowledge, even though the quest is already over. He does not want to admit that the quest is done. And accepting God and going into heaven would mean to accept that the quest is over and done with. And the second example is a mother who loves her son more than God. Now, the person who meets her keeps inviting her to heaven, but he keeps telling her, you're going to because he doesn't want to deceive her. When you enter heaven, you're going to be so enthralled and so in love with God that you'll forget about the love of your child. Now, it's not that you'll forget about your child, it's just that he won't become the most important thing in your life anymore. And she keeps trying to say, well, how long is it going to take before I see my child? And the person is trying to tell her, you're missing the point. Finally, in frustration, anger, and rage at the fact that she is being denied her son, or she thinks she's being denied her son, she storms off while screaming, I believe in a God of love. Now, I'm not really doing these passages justice because I'm going off of memory, and I don't have the books in front of me because I borrowed them from a friend, and I read them and I had to give them back. So I don't have them in front of me where I can actually read the passages in front of you. And then finally, Dante's Inferno shows how, after we leave God and resign ourselves to hell or send ourselves to hell, we're responsible for the punishments that we receive. If you read closely Dante's Inferno, you'll discover that all of the punishments are occurring because the people are trying to escape the punishments, but in the very act of trying to escape the punishments, they continuously inflict the punishment onto them. If they would just stop and admit that they were at fault and say, I made a mistake, I messed up, then the idea is that they would no longer be punished, but accepted into purgatory and then heaven. But the problem is, they don't want to, and they never will stop and admit that they were wrong. So it's not God with a big gavel and saying, oh, you're going to hell because you broke these laws and these commandments. It's more of God standing in front of the door to the house and there's a big party going on and he's welcoming you with open arms and you're staring inside and you're saying, no, I do not want to go in there. I'm going to stay out here in the rain because I'm too prideful to accept your love. That's really what it is. It's not God in sending us to hell. It's us doing it to ourselves. We are responsible for it. The second point, which was an unusual and one that I've never heard of before, Christopher Hitchens claims that to say that our knowledge of good and evil comes from God is an insult to humanity and humanity's capabilities. To claim that it's a gift from God is an insult. Now, I'm a little confused as to why he thinks that. He didn't explain that explicitly in the video, or at least in the video clip that I saw, so if anyone who has an idea onto why could explain that, I would greatly appreciate that. But from the Christian perspective, life itself is a gift. The fact that I'm sitting here right now and talking to you guys and am alive to do so is a gift from God, from the Christian perspective. The fact that you're alive and doing what you want to do is a gift from God. And yet, how is that an insult? I mean, people would argue that I'm, don't have a correct understanding of science, but if you know me, you'll understand that that's not entirely the case. But the issue seems to be we're insulting the intelligence of the human person. But, since we're alive, everything about the human person is a gift. So, I'm a little confused as to why he views that as an insult. But, to kind of address his claim, the reason why it seems that the knowledge of good and evil would be a gift is because of two reasons. The first is Nietzsche. Nietzsche was a atheistic philosopher, for those of you who are not aware, and he is what was and probably still would be angry with a lot of atheists today for trying to hold on to the notion of good and evil, which is a Christian concept. If there is a good God, then anything not of that God is evil. Now, there's useful and not useful, or as Nietzsche would put it, good, bad, but not good, evil. And so, Nietzsche would say, from my understanding of it, he would disagree with Christopher Hitchens, and he would claim that that Christopher Hitchens is trying to hold on to the Christian notion of good and evil. There is no such thing as knowledge of good and evil. There's just useful and not useful. So it doesn't even matter if it came from this imaginary God. It's knowledge of the useful or knowledge of the not useful. So Nietzsche would be in complete agreement with me insofar as it's not an insult to say knowledge of good and evil comes from God. If there is a God, that's where we would get it from. But knowledge of good and evil is an illusion or a lie created by Christianity in order to keep people enslaved to Christianity, or at least that's the claim Nietzsche makes. I obviously disagree with him there, but that's philosophy for you. Secondly, why do I think intelligence or knowledge of good and evil is a gift from God? While I do acknowledge that intelligence can develop through natural evolutionary means, it seems to me very, very, very unlikely for us to reach our level of intelligence naturally and in the way that we have it. And the reason for this hesitation to completely accept this is from my understanding of the way evolution works. The way it was described to me, and I've told this to other people who have a better understanding of evolution and they've said it's a good analogy, that it's like a bicycle factory. You have the workers making the bikes day in and day out, and it's the same bike day in, day out. And eventually, because one of the workers stayed up too late partying and came into work hungover and tired, that he made a bicycle seat that was a little different than the rest. But this particular difference in the bicycle seat was a lot more comfortable than what they normally make. And so the person who bought the bicycle seat noticed that and told his friends, and they wrote back to the company saying, hey, we want this bicycle seat. And so they start making the bikes with that type of bicycle seat. And so now, again, they're making the same bike with a new bicycle seat day in and day out. Another mistake happens, except this time it's just a little bolt. Doesn't really do anything, doesn't really get noticed. The person who buys it, however, feels like since it's not necessary, he goes ahead and removes the bolt. But no mention is made to the company of it. And so the bolt's just removed from the design of the bicycle. It was a mistake, it doesn't actually happen. But the problem is that bolt was necessary and essential for the development of an engine piece by piece that eventually would have created the motorcycle. Now, it seems to me that for intelligence to develop the way that it had, it would be necessary for the species to receive it as completely and almost all at once. Otherwise, the species would not have seen a use for intelligence. I mean, just kind of take high school, for example. The stereotypical high school. You have the big football jockeys who don't do well on their tests and don't do well in school and are not very intelligent, yet they get all the girls and they're very popular and everybody wants to be just like them. As opposed to the nerds who are very intelligent, very smart, not a whole lot of them, but they're shunned by the high school society. It seems to me that something very similar would happen with the very, very basic level of intelligence that would have evolved from humanity's ancestors. I mean, and just to kind of give another example, people talk about the cave paintings being a form of communication. Well, it's either a form of communication or something that they did to aesthetically please themselves. The problem with that is it doesn't make sense from an evolutionary standpoint, or at least I don't think it does, because in order for it to be used as a form of communication, they would have had to have gone out, found good edible berries, mashed those berries, and then plastered them onto a wall. And the other cavemen would have just viewed that one individual as being crazy and insane and not associated with him. Because why would you destroy good berries in that way? The other issue is it seems a lot more complicated and more effort to take place than verbal or body language communication done in that way. So it seems to me that intelligence itself is a gift from God. Now, I'm not saying that there wasn't a natural evolutionary explanation from it, but it just doesn't seem like it could take place without any outside help. That's just my thinking on it. And that's why I have no issue with saying knowledge of good and evil comes from God. His third point about religion being our first attempt at truth, it's a very subtle, but it seems like an ad hominem fallacy, and I could be mistaken. Essentially, he's saying that because religion came about during a time period when we simply just didn't know better, we shouldn't listen to religion. If that's true, then why should we listen to the statements that Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle made about logic and how to use logic? what they said about logic is very valid and seems to be valid, and it stands or falls on their own terms. Shouldn't the same be done with religion, at least, critically, academically speaking, to study it on its own terms and not evaluate it based on when it came out of and the so-called scientific intelligence of the people? I do want to clarify something as well. He makes a side comment. It's not really important to the conversation here, but he does make a comment at around this point in the talk that how circumcision was necessary for salvation. It was not necessary for salvation. For the Jewish people, it was a sign of separation from the Gentiles. And in the Acts of the Apostles, at what was called the Council of Jerusalem, that very question came up. Does one need to be a Jew before one becomes a Christian? Now, baptism was viewed as what saved a person, not circumcision. And the apostles decided that the act of circumcision was not necessary to have before one became baptized. In other words, one did not need to be a Jew in order to become a Christian. So I just wanted to throw that out there and clarify circumcision is not necessary for salvation. Also, he makes a claim that as we come to a better and more perfect understanding of science, we eliminate a lot of the claims made about God. I will admit it eliminates a lot of the arguments about God and the arguments of the God of the gaps, which are, I don't know why the sun rises, therefore God. Now, I don't think my argument for the existence of God falls under that category, but that's a topic for another video or another discussion. Finally, he says that God, created man. If for the Christians like myself who accept evolution, and for several thousand years just kind of sat back like this and did absolutely nothing, just was indifferent. Well, the thing is, and I've mentioned this to some of you already, that God exists outside of time. There is no time for God. And the way I like to describe this is it's similar to us being a fish in a stream of water. God reaches down and with his hand interacts with that water, and we encounter the fingers, and each finger is an interaction of God, and we encounter the first finger, and we think that is one unique separate action. Then we encounter the second finger, and we think that is another one individual separate action. But it's actually one action. So for God, when he created the world, at the same time he was talking to Abraham, at the same time that he was watching Christ die on the cross, at the same time that the world was ending. Same action. So it wasn't that God was sitting back. Now for us, there was a time process, but God was actively participating in the events of history at different points in the same single action. And then continuing on from there, Christopher Hitchens makes the claim that it's just absolutely ridiculous to think God only interacted with the particular Jewish people within the Middle East these were illiterate people. Why didn't he go to like China, for example, where they had language and writing and some form of the scientific method? Well, this is where the fittingness argument comes in. China was a very, it didn't really have an open idea about a monotheistic God, or at least as far as I know. According to a traditional story of Abraham, it's not in the Bible, but I will show evidence that kind of supports this story. During this time period, the idea was that the sky was in two halves. You had day on one end, so the blue sky on one end, and the dark, starry night on the other. Well, it is possible on a bright sunny day, if you happen to be in a cave with a little hole on the top, to look up and see the stars. Well, by seeing the stars, and so you see the stars during the day. And during this time period, the way that the Middle Eastern people would create a well is not like the way we think of it with a wall and the bucket, but it would be just a hole on the ground, flat, level with the ground, so you wouldn't see it unless you knew it was there. And it would collect rainwater, and it would store it until it was ready to be eaten or to be drunk. Now it is entirely possible for someone to fall down that hole or to be placed down that hole, and we have an example of Joseph in the Bible being placed down the hole. Now, it is entirely possible as well that Abraham, as a young boy, out playing with his friends or something, falling down a well that he had no idea was there. And he looks up to cry for help, and he sees the stars when it's broad daylight. Now, why is this important? Well, during this time period, it was believed that the stars were gods, and that the sun was a god moving across the sky, and different things like that. Well, Abraham, because of that discovery, came to the conclusion that they weren't gods, that there weren't any pagan gods. So he became, at this point, at least according to the traditional story, open to the idea of a single individual God. And that is when God appeared to Abraham. Now, is there any evidence in the Bible or Scripture supporting the possibility of this story? Well, at one point, when God talks to Abraham and says, "Go out and count the number of stars, and if you are able to count them, so shall your descendants be." And Abraham believed in God, and God accredited it to him as an act of faith. Well, within 2 or 3 verses, so within the same time period, within the same 24-hour period, it then says, the sun began to set. So that means that Abraham went out and looked at the stars during broad daylight. Now, if he accepted that two-half sky, or the sky divided in half idea, he would have looked out and seen no stars, thought there weren't any stars, and thought, oh, that means I will have no children. But he looked at the sky, knew that there were stars behind the blue sky that he just couldn't see yet, and also that those stars could not be counted. So he knew that he was going to have multiple descendants, he just couldn't see them yet, or see how. And that is why God accredited it to him as an act of faith. So that's why God revealed himself to Abraham, because Abraham was open to the idea of a individual God. He had rejected the pagan gods of his country. Now, why Jerusalem particularly? Jerusalem was a crossroads of a major trading route called the King's Highway, I believe is the name of it. And essentially, if you had to get to Egypt, which had practically all the food in the world, it was the largest producer of food at the time, and so everybody was going to Egypt, back and forth between Egypt. And so Jerusalem is right on that trade route, and so everyone was being aware of the Jewish people. And the idea, or what the Jews were supposed to do, was to help bring as many people into the Jewish family as they possibly could. And we have accounts in the Bible of how they kept failing to do so. They kept falling into other religions when they were supposed to bring other people to their religion. And then finally, we have the Roman Empire that conquered practically the entire known world, but it didn't exactly reach all the way to China. As far as I know, it stopped at India, but wasn't able to get all the way to China. And Christ appears at the height of the Roman Empire. And because of his appearance, and the fact that there were the Roman roads and traveling was made so much easier during this time period, and we have the gospel reaching all the way to Spain and India. So it traveled the entire known world within a generation or two, which would not have been possible if it was in China. So that's why God acted, or at least it seems to me that's why God acted within that area, geographical location, because he knew about the Roman Empire and knew that it would be the best way to have his message spread. again, not really important to the argument, but I do, again, want to make another clarification. Christopher Hitchens seems to make a claim about God demanding human sacrifice. The Christian and Jewish God does not demand human sacrifice. But Christian thinker, what about the story of Isaac when God demanded Abraham to sacrifice his son? Well, if you recall from the story, it talks about how Abraham goes out and chops the wood himself and then goes 3 days to the place where he was supposed to sacrifice his son. Well, we know where he started and where he was going to sacrifice his son, and it's not a 3-day journey. It's a day's journey at most, if you're walking normally. So Abraham was obviously dragging his feet, and Abraham is also considered a tribal king, so he had servants to chop the wood, so why is he chopping the wood himself? Because he needed time to think. Men tend to have a habit of change. If we need to think about a problem, we want to do something monotonous, that's easy to do, that doesn't require much thought, so that way then we're doing something while we're thinking about our problem. So yes, men think about problems. And human sacrifice to a particular god or gods was common at this time. And so when Abraham tells his servants, the boy and I will return, why would he say that if they wouldn't have thought twice if he just said, and I will return? So Abraham knows that this son that he has, that he's about to kill, is the son of the promise. At this point in the editing process, I realized that I had forgotten to say why Abraham said both of us will be back. It's because he came to the conclusion that God would raise Isaac from the dead. If he had not come to that conclusion, he would have just said, I will be back, not we both will be back. My personal theory on this is that Abraham started to have doubts as to whether or not he trusted or loved God more than his own son. And God knew that, and so it gave Abraham this opportunity to show Abraham, you do love me more than your son, to help put the doubt that Abraham had at peace. That's my personal reading on it. Because, as you recall, God stops Abraham from sacrificing his son, and at no other point is human sacrifice required. And before you bring up the slaughter of the children of the 10 plagues of Egypt, or the killing of the women and children in a lot of the battles, that's not a human sacrifice. That was a disease caused by God in the first one, and warfare in the second. While both result in the destruction of a human life, it's not a sacrifice to God. And I don't want to get into those particular details at this time. I might do an essay as to why we say he's a good God when these particular actions are depicted of him in the Bible. But like I said, that's going to be for another time. But those were my thoughts on the Christopher Hitchens debate video titled Christopher Hitchens Destroys Christianity. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope this made a lot of sense.